Greetings, everyone. This is our lecture on Central Africa. We're going to be looking at Cameroon, Congo, and Rwanda. So first, we'll take a look at just the Cameroon, just a bit. And I'm only kind of using this as, in part, a way to transfer into Central Africa. Some of this has to do with proximity with Cameroon's location. Just to the kind of southeast, right around the sort of edge of the continent. There, we'll show it in map and class. Maybe that's one feature of mentioning that in terms of the sort of cultural interactions that's going on relative to West Africa, things like the jihads from all the way up in upper West Africa, at least in terms of their start, will have a reach as far as the Cameroon. You have these sorts of spreadings of Islam, and some of those come from the Hausa states, which are would be just sort of north of them in Nigeria. So you got some that kind of thing, as well as you got similar sort of cultural reaches of people from some of the cultures of the South, some of the cultures connected with the Bakongo and some of the other peoples who live in what we would call West Central Africa, the regions of modern day Congo and Angola. So Congo's kind of in that space. So that's part of our choice of it. Another one too is it just gives us another insight in terms of sort of the French mission, and their engagement with this state, especially, I mean, this place, especially as it begins to sort of contemplate and push towards statehood, right? And you know, um, suppression leads to war, as you can imagine, right? And also encourages sort of extremism as well, right? And you do have sort of this kind of attention, these kinds of things being set in motion, right? Two separate leaders in the 1960s. I'm drawing just sort of straight in the context of its independence. One being Ahijo, who becomes the first president and a member of the Cameroonian Union Party, right? This is a guy who had a close connection to France. And then on the other side, you have Felix Roland and then later Ruben Mboye, who maybe, on behalf of the UPC party, pushed for a socialist reconstruction of the local economy, right? And a break from France. Right. I mean, now, so you can see their side is very much would be on the tenor of the kinds of things that Thomas Sankara was talking about, that we studied prior. This sort of very clear break. If you think about France and its history of this sort of socialist thought, going back to very very early sort of socialist thinkers and their articulations of these ideas. We'll talk about some in class, but even this sort of notion. In that context, you look at the response to these sort of socialist sort of movements in former French colonies. You can see maybe some connections that work there, right? But France doesn't, maybe at least politically, encourage that aspect of a sort of open dialogue relative to their colonies. So you do have this sort of tension that literally will break the country apart, as you can imagine. I mean, the tension of this will become a very violent sort of feature of things, right? And you see this sort of play out. I mean, and I use the work of Mark Delancey to sort of get at the sort of two sides of this. And I think this becomes a dynamic that many African nations have to face. I like the way he condenses this down into very, very clear terms. This is what people are dealing with, right? And so you may rewind back and freeze this so you can read this in its entirety, because it really is beginning to sort of speak to some things, right? One side sort of says that the colonizer, through direct colonial rule, so this is maybe looking at the French system, right? Uh, um, was no longer necessary to gain the economic advantages of Europe, right? So, in other words, at a certain point in the system of colonialism, in the system of administration of direct colonial apparatus, that the numbers, the use of labor, maybe infrastructure costs, other things, budget, money's on the top of that list of questions. There may be some political issues there as well. But money's a big feature there, right? And people are sort of looking at that and say, well, you know what? Having all these soldiers on the ground, having it coming down on the ground, you saw the way the black and white color film poked fun at it coming down. This is sort of a fluke in many ways, right? And so this is not necessarily advantageous, right? To Europe, just as, for instance, the colonialism was a progression from exploiting people through slave labor, right? It was, remember how it was described. Remember how Tia Buxton and these folks described this, right? So again, that's another sort of aspect of that progression, right? And so in that way, a system had been developed whereby Europe got its raw materials and sold its finished goods. Because the local administration of that system by white colonists was no longer necessary, it could be turned over to a class that had been produced by the system. Those Africans whose interests would best be served by maintaining a system of economic exchange established by the colonial regime, right? And then the other side of this gets at a whole different perspective. Others have argued that there has always been opposition to colonial rule and that it has taken time for African nationalist forces to gather strength to develop communication links and cooperative efforts sufficient to force the colonial ruler to turn over political control of the territories to the Africans. Right. And I mean, you guys know I don't try to read the whole thing all the time, but you could see there's something here. It sets up a sort of a dynamic. And I think we could debate this. I think when you get this in the context of Emile Cabral, maybe Franz Fanon, you can sort it's touchable. There may be some questions or issues are raised, but at its root, it really presents the dilemma of political leadership for Africans in the era after the end of independence. It puts the challenge in the real square faces. Either what becomes of this is a class of these people who are going to parrot the language and the ideations and the actions of their or of their colonial administrators, or people who are going to maybe take it a different route as this sort of African nationalist ideation, right? And and what way does that go, right? And so I think for us, the Cameroon becomes that sort of touch ground for that by the Civil War and other things that will unfold there, right? There's also a great novel I frequently use, and we'll maybe take a touch of it in class called Houseboy that deals with the experiences of this sort of young child who's a houseboy essentially. And in two books, he describes his experiences, right? But in the end, he becomes very bitter in terms of everything that he's been exposed to. We'll chop through that book some if we have time. But that'll be maybe how we'll discuss the Cameroon some in terms of maybe local culture and context a bit, but it's definitely caught up in this sort of Cold War system. And Cameroon's maybe less in terms of size and geography and resources relevant, but not as relevant as somewhere like the Congo and Angola, right, where we're going to look next. Or then even in a more pervasive moment where you add into this question of nationalism or parroting of Europe, racial ideology. And I mean the really extreme, horrible stuff, the kind that is in fact inculcated in Europe through the Nazi socialist ideology and other sorts of manifestations, right? And the stench of those German ideologies are certainly manifested in Rwanda. So we'll look at those two dynamics in this section on Central Africa, right? Um, I mean, and I like to get into cosmology. So I mean, that's why sort of, and talking about the Cameroon, we didn't necessarily touch on that, but I think if we look at Houseboy some, we'll get a feel for some the mindset of people there. And let's switch now to the Congo, which is further south, West Central Africa, right? Today it's like there's the Republic of Congo, there's a Democratic Republic of Congo. So you have like two of those, and they're both next. When we see the map, you'll see some of the complications of this. But these are all tensions and issues drawn out in post-independence borders and other kinds of things, right? But always have been a belief in a central God system, right? And the central of that, not necessarily medicines, but a pantheon of gods. There's a very great doc on Congolese social, symbolism that some of you guys have checked out and have used in some of your readings. But it's a good reference to contextualize some of this. So not a big pantheon of gods like maybe you might see with the Yoruba system and their sort of beliefs and divination process. Less so, just these sacred medicines. And then the elders and ancestral wisdom, those are the sort of impetuses of guidance and witchcraft, right? This kind of thing, right? This Malewa or Mawela, one who rules and has made a breathing power within, right? And it's this emanating sort of power manifested as far as, this pre-colonial notion, captive folks who came from this region become mild men in the tradition of these sort of spirit priests. And those mild men are very influential to things like Ethiopian Rastafarianism and other things. You could find some interesting kinds of correlations there. But I don't want to get into off into the diaspora within West Central Africa. This belief system and imagine it in the sort of fullness of it, where it's not sort of hidden underground, right? And manifested in the sort of living ideas in the day-to-day life of folks. And we're talking about people who live in civilizations, right? Uh, uh, um, what will be known as South Salvador, and Banza Congo. I think the name is the same, if I'm not mistaken, right? But they give it, they ideate that real name, but it becomes San Salvador with, I think, the interface with the Catholics. There's more to that story, but it's a city. People live there. And imagine the fullness of these kinds of ideations and notions of self within a municipality that aren't under duress, right? That's what I'm saying, or this kind of thing, right? And so then, the local, the real space ground is also an imagined ground, because it's the Mbanza Congo, which is this sort of idealized capital city governed by a strong chief, supernaturally inspired, ensures every citizen his or her due. And then remember, we talked to them about the semiotics of the folk of this region as well. I mean, particularly the Bakongo, and sort of paying attention to this Yoa cross, right? As a method or a symbol of oath making, spiritual boundary, and communication. And again, I mean, there's real symbolism at work. Each of the pieces of metal, function as a sort of element of sort of the spirit, or the element of the purging, or the power that this sort of ancestor or ancestral spirit possesses, right? And so you could see how people are going to make some interesting sort of equivocations to some things relative to someone taking a nail and nailing a cross, nailing someone on a cross, right? And that had a lot to do with the way the interface, as early as, we're talking, 16th century, when the Vatican and their representatives, the the Portuguese, the Dutch later, show up to trade, right? This kind of thing. So this is a powerful state that we're describing, that's emanating this sort of spiritual system, right? And it has real reach throughout the place. I mean, there's this great story of this priestess, Dona Kempavita, and if we have time, we may talk about her just a bit more in class as well. Um, but you know, the mountains where she comes from are they're called the Kimbangu Mountains. They're way deep in the interior. And I just imagine the idea of these folks having this connection to spiritual sorts of things, and cultural practice. Let me just say it that way. And then there's sort of the feature of it in a far away place. When we look at a map, maybe we can sort of show that out a little bit more clearly. But and then if we turn the corner, I guess, and look at um, who will be really featuring their colonial experience, it's going to be the Belgians, right? What you have here is um, where a good portion of the money that Leopold II was able to garner through some of his colonial efforts was put into the construction of this place, the completing of the construction, right? The park to Cinquanterra to celebrate the, I guess, 500 year. We'll look more at this online too, in class. But this just is a signal into the history of these folks, where they're coming from in Europe. So, and what's happening in Europe, and that sort of push pull in terms of bringing folks into Africa, right? Because this is really where it will play out, and this is where maybe I'm sort of focusing on that issue maybe a bit more here. Is because this is where the rubber hit the road. Remember, it's Leopold II who's going to gather everybody together. He's going to get Otto von Bismarck from Germany and New Germany. He's going to get and invite leaders from throughout Europe, Western Europe, and other places to come. I mean, remember, Jack Garfield, our president, is going to send a letter to say, "Hey, thanks for inviting, thanks for this kind of thing." So to let everyone know that we were ready to be engaged in this process of and what it becomes the great magnificent cake, the carving up of Africa. But even if you begin to look at the story of Leopold II, you see some real sort of character challenges there, and certainly I think play out in some of the actions that will happen, right? But his effort ultimately manifests in the sort of rebuilding of and the resources that go into the rebuilding of this park, this cinquantenaire. Um, our it's part of a it's part of a piece. It's part of a narrative in its own right. And it's a Belgium that has went through its own challenges, right? From being a part of a confederated system of states that include the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium, to maybe the sort of self identity, the sort of notion of self determination, this sort of breaking away. And, that's the sort of ideal, you know, here we see France, being inspirational to the rest of Europe in terms of saying, hey, go out and gain your independence, be your own nation. Those ideas were very inspirational to folks. French ideas of liberty, literally, right? So, what ideas of liberty, right? What happens in the French Revolution, right? I mean, let's not, we could be very critical of what France is doing in Africa, and I'm going to be the first one to do that. But I'm also going to speak about the impact of the French Revolution as well, because there are some very important things there that are takeaways for Europe and for the rest of the world, for that matter. So let's be clear about the notion of challenging the power of the state. That really plays in 1789. Why will a king and a queen lose their head? There were real features of that were letting folks know that the social order was wrong, right? So that's a big thing that it will manifest in the idea in Belgium. I mean, something in 1789, and then something that will feature in French history several other times. We know there's more than one rebellion through the 19th century. But it's going to inspire Belgium to break away from this piece. Why? Because they said, well, we have a separate notion. For one thing, we were not Protestant, we're Catholic. For another thing, we have a closer affiliation with France, right? Class identity, self-determination in terms of their politics, right? And they were engaged in sort of reform and used in terms of making constitutional reform of all things, the Napoleonic Code, more aspects of it. So this really showed their maybe not necessarily interest, but affiliation or intersection with some of these ideas coming out of France at the time, right? Um, and ultimately recognized by Europe. Why am I spending all this time talking about it, right? And then one other thing, of course, is that, hey, it realizes its potential as an industrial powerhouse. It has coal, it has iron, it has textiles, it has glass, and the state is in the process of this sort of railroad production in the 19th century. Second to maybe, some places in England. Here's probably number two, right? Early, early industrial centers, right? In Europe, right? For sure. So this kind of thing. So Belgium sees where it is, right? Again, I mean, why play that? Because look how Belgium will interface with its presumed colonial, and it's not presumed. It's a very real attempt and effort to dominate a society for just under a century, maybe not as much as a century, right? Some 70, 80 years, right? And then a horrible process of going through independence that still hasn't completely finished itself, right? And the Congo already have been through. Remember, this is the place that sent the largest number of sort of captive folks back to the Americas, right? Half the folks who end up in the transatlantic system come from West Central Africa, right? But Congo and Angola, right? And so, in the moments after, and the sort of notions of the declarations of let's go back and re-civilize, there isn't very much talk about the West Central Africa, right? Folks are more interested in West Africa, I think, and some stuff at least early on, right? There isn't much talk, but there still is interest. That's just why Okay, let me sort of clarify what I mean by disinterested powers. Maybe it's in that aspect. But folks are looking, right? Remember that Henry Stanley, right, who navigated the Congo, right, and then all of a sudden people are going to start getting excited, right? Once he navigates the Congo, wherever we've ever heard that thing, that's Dr. Livingston, I presume, right? And that's part of that whole piece, right? Of them meeting. Like he sees another white man in Africa. They're walking through. He gets through. He finds the what they call Victorian Falls. It has another name, but it's the source of the Nile. And he's not far from there. And I guess he sees another white guy walking through there with his own little group of a guide and other folks. And he's like, oh. And he says, Dr. Livingston, I presume. Well, of course. Who the hell else? All right. But anyway, that's the story. They published it. But because of that story, everybody starts getting excited. And now the French, the Germans, the British get this African fever, right? And so Leopold II has got to get in on the game. And when we look at maybe some aspects of his life a little bit more, you sort of see some of this, right? But he wants to get in on the game. This is his chance, right? So this is why he convenes the Berlin Conference. He invites all these folks together, right? For free trading for the European partners, but it's free for them, you know. And the ways they would sort of and make this freedom work was, one, they tighten local land ownership. Remember how Ghana busts that open at the latter part of this century. They're already cracking that. You see, they're just loading this into place about 18, this is about 18, this is during the Berlin Conference, right? So already a footprint is there of the Belgians in the region, but they haven't really established themselves. But by the time they've really got a toehold, you already have Casey Hayford within a decade or so writing to say the Queen has no power to come in and say arbitrarily that they can tighten local land ownerships to land under active cultivation, violating crop rotation, but also ancestral or ancestral and centuries old notions of land ownership and possession, this kind of thing, right? But in West Central Africa, they said, hey, any land that was not accepted could be under the possession of the Belgian state, right? And if you see his crib and his personal reserve, it's like a mirror of what will be later what Mobutu will live in. Like you could look at his crib and look at Mobutu's crib. You say, okay, I see. Why did Mobutu build a huge crib in the middle of this sort of special, beautiful place in the middle of the West Central African forest zone, heavy forest zone, right? Why did he build one in there, right? A beautiful crib, make a runway, come in and bring his stuff to him. Well, he probably was thinking about this dude's crib here, because Leopold II had a pretty nice reserve there on Leopold Lake, which we'll take a look at both, so you can sort of do some compare and contrasting if you like, right? And he's the largest monopolizer of land. He owns all of the land control. They were the largest. The monopoly of land controlled by the state, and they were the largest stakeholder in the private companies too. So you bring in companies, but the state also is vested in those companies as well, right? Heavily vested, not just sort of varied money from wealthy people, but the state itself as an apparatus. That kind of piece is sort of, you could sort of see something that's a little messy, right? Clearly, right? Why are they here lined up to hear the gut and get after all this stuff here, right? What's the purpose of this? What are people so excited about? What does Belgium have what does the Congo have that everybody wants, right? And I make a reference to the heart of darkness here, because certainly, right? And some of you see it, and some of you have heard of it, and I've made reference to it before, this coltan. It's a real piece. We'll talk more about it in class, right? But essentially, it's valuable stuff, this is what goes in and fuels all these materials and resources. This is the reason, essentially, we're able to even have this sort of hold these sorts of classes within this space, because in truth, it's this coltan, it's this mineral, right? Um, and for a moment there, you know, there was only probably there was like one place in on the globe where it was known to be, and it was Congo. There are other places now, but those have come online probably in the last probably 2 decades, 2.5 decades or so. They're pretty recent, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 3 decades. But for a while, it was Congo, Congo, Congo. And think about the violence that got uprooted in the context of that, right? A lot of the tensions that will play out in Rwanda and in other places, right, that are their border states there. Look at where Rwanda is, right up on the border there. And one of the tensions that's going to play out, look at that big old chunk of, do you see where the coltan is in its proximity to the state of Rwanda? And do you know that some of the violences that will occur based in part on race, some of this will be an impetus here now. I'm just going to say, not entirely, but it's going to figure here. It just adds more to the chaos. And you got gold nearby, significant gold reserves, and diamond and other resources within close proximity. So, you can imagine what kind of a mess this is going to stir up, right? This is just a mess waiting to happen. And this stuff becomes super valuable, right? And it always becomes, and I hate to go on a rant here, but I'm about to do one just for a minute because I find it somewhat duplicitous that in many sort of protest movements and in all these articulations of standing up, and I'm talking everybody, they got their phone up, but not one person has paused and taken a look at this issue. And for me, I mean, in a public space, and acknowledge this, at least acknowledge it, and it's despicable. I'm just gonna be honest. It's one of the things I have an issue with it, and I mean, it is what it is. We'll have to use it. And you go to places throughout Africa and West Central Africa. To this day, you go to Kinshasa, people on their phone. Believe that. But by the same token, hold on, man. We have a responsibility to at least acknowledge that part of what's going on here, and part of one of the features of the violence has to be this content. And maybe we can make better decisions around it, right? We can have that kind of conversation about other resources. We can get gassed up about the oil, no pun intended, right? We get serious about diamonds, cold diamonds, and blood diamonds and all that. But where's this one at? All right, I'm done. But it's a very much a violent regime that's holding, enforcing folks and systems that are akin to forced labor to reach quotas, not unlike what they used to do with the rubber quota. And this is why this contemporary issue of the coltan is such a sort of negative, because it evokes the images of the chicote, the rubber hippo hide lash that was used to sort of whip people and force folks into these sorts of systems to meet a rubber quota. And that was one put on them by the Belgians. This was during the experience of colonialism, right? Before the coltan, So, I mean, even prior to all these minerals becoming a feature, especially from about 1960 onward, maybe a little bit earlier, right? It's the rubber, right? And you have a real push of violence and other extremist measures to get people to meet regime, to meet the cost, to meet the need, the quota, right? And you have folks like George Washington Williams, who's an African American, 1890, before anybody else, before Roger Casement and E. Morrell are writing, George Washington Williams in 1890 is telling everybody there's a bad thing going on here, brutal malfeasance, right? And then very later on, I mean, to show the arrogance of this system, right? The arrogance of the system, or maybe just I don't know, the arrogance of this system. The the regime most responsible for the violence and chaos of a rubber quota and an intent to extract rubber from folks with such extreme and violent tactics, right? That it's undermining the rubber economy, right? And then so these folks will say, well, listen, we're going to investigate ourselves and we're going to come back and report to you whether or not we're being violent. Well, gee, I wonder how that's going to turn out, right? So, and it becomes just a story of horrors, man. It really is a sad tale in the human experience that you will cut off people's hands. We watch some film image, so I mean, so you can make this connection. And one of the scholars is in Antwerp, and he starts to talk about the meaning of the word Antwerp, and that it had this early connection to a Roman god or something tearing off the hand of a local person in there in West Central Europe. And I'm kind of like, man, that's sort of jacked up, man. If you sort of look at that connection, that they're doing this with these hands, and then he goes into this little shop and he's in Antwerp and he's telling you the story, and you're looking at the guy holding the hand. It's pretty disturbing. It's kind of problematic, but it does sort of I don't know. If anything, man, it just for me it nails the crime down. It nails the crime down. You can't back out of it anymore. I mean, it nails the crime down to me. And for the next question might be around accountability. That's another question discussion that can be had. But before we get there, Belgium, the Congo independent state, Leopold II's sort of regime, pronounces back. There's just you can't deny the violence. So then the state itself steps in and becomes a Belgian kind. How does it come from the power of the royal Leopold II out of his hands and into maybe the sort of more state apparatus of government and this kind of thing? It might be just use of names and terms there some. But it essentially does change hands because people say he's undermining the ability of the place to be more profitable, right? But there's no real change in things. It just essentially says, maybe we'll use the violence more, strategically, perhaps. But essentially, the sort of tearing down of folks, that's going to continue on, right? And so, and where will it put people if they want to gain their independence, right? And you would think it really would set them aback. I mean, I myself am sitting here saying, how are these folks going to do anything? Essentially, because they've been sort of put in this bad rut. And Casely Hayford and these folks in Ghana are already rounding the corner. They're coming up quick by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Already talking in terms of like, look, let us have some responsibility, this kind of a thing, in a nice strategic way to sort of ease their way back into taking control of their country, right, as much as they can, right? But why can't they do this, right? Yeah, they are ill-designed. They are under an ill-designed authoritarianism, right? That is sort of based on racialized human inequality, right? And then the land concessions and all the money, the folks who get to come to Europe to develop are Europeans. And I'm sorry. I mean, I'm going to say this, but I'm going to say it because I go to Africa regularly, and I have a right to say it. I'm going to say it because I know on behalf of my people who live in Africa, I'm going to say it. That it's a frustrating moment sometimes to see how Europe pronounces with arrogance in Africa quite frequently. And then that's not everyone. And no, that's not everyone. That is not everyone. Because there are people there who are doing much better things. I'll talk some about that in the next section when we talk about Rwanda. But in some instances, too, you can see the real arrogance of folks from Europe and America and Africa. And it's not a nice thing to see. I'm going to say that. And because of this very system, because then they will come in with a presumptive notion of how trying to teach someone how to do something effective, and and I mean in a paternal way, not in a way to help. But forgetting that, well, the game had been even on the continent, there was an attempt to lopside the game. So that kind of a thing. You have local chiefs whose authority gets they have none, right? And they just become a puppet for the bureaucracy of the state. This kind of thing, right? When you doing stuff like continuing on with a policy of like, okay, you didn't meet your labor today, you didn't get with the labor, you didn't bring me enough rubber today. Okay, we're gonna take your whole family, and until you and your guys go back out and come with my rubber, we're gonna keep your family here, your family here, your children, your wife. We're gonna keep them here for you now until you demand. And this is just sort of the way that this was being done, right? And then the cutting off of hands. If you don't do this, what we're gonna do? This becomes a feature of intimidation, right? And then literal forms of enslavement and real violence here at work, right? And you're hiring out folks, the local men who are part of warrior clans to go out and engage and enact this sort of violence, right? I mean, what legacy will that leave after or in the context of all of this? It sort of further inflates prior tensions that might have existed, or maybe in places where there were none. Now there maybe is a new tension renewed there, a new tension that exists there. So this kind of a thing. And I don't, for me, this sort of objectivity and this sort of talk of colonialism, and sort of saying, well, you really ought to balance out this with a dialogue that sort of pays homage to, well, to some degree, Europe, they did things that were helpful in Africa, and I don't disagree with that because I like to be objective. But by the same token, I just have to I just have to say the story because this one is the one that we never hear, right? This is the one we never hear, right? Or we hear some jaded version of it, all right. I know I can get on a thing, but it's like what Simon Kimbangu says, right? In the context of everything that happens, I have to go to his words in 1921. He says, "What happiness have they brought us? They have given us a road we do not need, a road that brings more and more foreigners. The white man sends us missions to destroy our belief and to teach our children to recite fine-sounding words. But there are words we believe in anyway, and we live according to our beliefs, which is more than the white man does." Right? And you could use e.g. Christianity if you want to throw that in there, or you could do e.g. capitalism and free markets if you want to throw that up in there, or e.g. I don't know, how do we talk about treating your fellow man as your fellow man, woman as your fellow woman, what have you. How do we put that? How do we put that in there into the EG and the parentheticals right after that? Because those are the things that's being spelled out there. The duplicity of that, right? Someone who even himself was becomes a separatist, this former son of a shaman, local spiritualist, who becomes a Christian convert, and then begins this freak of all things of sort of millennialism that's coming, a day of judgment that's upon us because of these things. Circulated around in terms of miracles and other things and religious expression as well as political protests, right? So you can imagine this is starting to dry folks up. So he had to go away and be in prison essentially for the majority of his life because of that, right? And even this sort of missionaries who make the case for their African acknowledgement of African beliefs, oftentimes play a pivotal role in sort of denouncing those, right? And yes, the literacy, the sanitation, and the medicine and the modern forms are great things. I mean, and those things look much, I think, better in hindsight than they do now, especially because we're clearer that the very projects of colonialism in these places displace and unmade local systems of literacy, sanitation, and medicine. And yes, they existed. So it's in that context, right? This is these are the ways we gotta save this, right? We have to be clear. Yeah, though, someone comes and sees you at maybe in a state of needing assistance and helps you. That's always a good thing. It's better to help than to not with paternalism and what have you. So it doesn't make it right. But local cosmologies and worldviews converge right around these issues because that's the thing, right? You have people denouncing the African cosmologies and spiritualities, the Bakongo belief system, in a highly idealized state where every citizen has his due. Right, we denounce that. That's the devil. That's the devil. That's Satanism. That's the devil's work, right? But then Christianity is the one that's gonna bring us out and save us and keep us and get us right. But then we see expressions of Christianity that wouldn't fit now. So it's this kind of thing. This is this critique of this, and it does force you. And people say, well, you're tearing down the notion of folks' faith. Not necessarily. Not necessarily, because those who know the truth already know this was just a way for folks to use and take belief and like Christianity and Judeo-Christian ideas and then use them and turn them to their own advantage. And no, that's never happened before, has it? All right. Anyways, and this it's a sad narrative, and maybe I got a bit more of a scowl about it and a bit more to say, more critical, because the way it plays out is it's not a nice thing, and it's not a nice thing. And one of the things you stress here is that as much as I'm saying that Congo is in a quandary and it's facing a challenge, what Patrice Lumumba proves to the world is that even a state as fractured as the Congo could come together, could be brought together, right? And if Belgium had just backed out the way they said they were doing, man, or as maybe let's go back to their moment of independence in 1830 and see how they would have felt if other states had said, no, we're going to completely keep our hands exactly all in everything that you do, your economics. You guys got coal, we want all that coal. Right, you guys are becoming a new sort of industrial center and hub in Europe. We're going to control that. We're going to bring in our people. You're not going to be able to use or integrate or even do it in a multinational way that's beneficial for you. We're going to put our thumbs on it. Somebody's going to come in and put their thumbs on it. No way. No way. Right? And then you turn the corner though, and you look here, and you see this. And you see, well, a state trying to just stand up for the first time. And Patrice Lumumba is part of this process that's bringing this state to a place. Don't forget Simon and Kimbangu. Don't forget there are other or early names that have to be sort of features of this. Don't forget the Pan-Africanist ideas that are also emanating around the rest of the continent at this time. That have got people beginning to say, you know what, it's time. It's time. Remember the 1945 Pan-African Congress when people say we're going to push the Freedom Charter now. That's the end of this talking of it. We're going to make it go. Right. And this, I think of it in that moments where people are taking up arms to now begin to gain their independence. And then put Patrice Lumumba in there. And you can see that he becomes a very important figure, right? He's leading people and he's opened the door. He's beginning to question some things. He's beginning to critique the status quo. He was not unlike a voice like a Thomas Sankara, right? And that he had much to say about the flaw of this sort of colonial process, right? And as we watch elements of the film and look at his life a bit more closely, you're going to see he did some things. He was involved in a few instances. He denounces the head of Belgium that comes for independence. He denounces him. But not really. The Belgian representative, who I think is a descendant of Leopold II, he takes it as a denouncement, but I think he really should have been taking his hat off. We're gonna watch it together. We'll decide, right? But some folks say that was the moment that was the beginning of the end for Lumumba, right? And we'll look at some of that features of that experience there, right? But when he was killed, it erupted. You know, there were folks picketing all over the place, right? And then I just always think it's funny that Adlai Stevenson from here in Illinois, who happened to be the U.S. ambassador at the time, apologized for the actions of Negroes who were picketing the UN, blaming the World Organization for the death of Patrice Lumumba, and they broke through the UN security guard en masse, right inside the secretariat where a discussion of the situation was going on, and they blew the top out like, yo, but they had to, they were informed, they knew, people knew, the word had got on the street. People started, who is Patrice Lumumba? Well, let me tell you who Patrice Lumumba is, and then you're gonna hear it. Folks knew what he was doing. Malcolm X knew who he was, right? People knew, right? And then all of a sudden, you get into a context of another leader being killed. And guess who has been affiliated with both? All right, I'm gonna shut up because I'm not going into that conspiratorial quagmire. I don't even need it to make my case. I don't even need it. You can just look at what's right on the front street. You don't got to do no digging. You don't got to do no decide. Just look at the front street. You can see, right? What is reported in the New York Times in 12/2/1963? What does Malcolm X say in the moments of the death of JFK? Right. Well, he says something that will stir up a pot of anger, right? Part of what he says is that the chickens are coming home to roost. He says that, right? And then in the New York Times, they say it's a fanatic and flexibly dogmatic statement, right? And part of what X adds to it is that the murders of, what's the first name he mentions there? And also to that of Medgar Evers and several others, but the first name he mentions is Patrice Lumumba, was among the examples as chickens coming home to roost. Now you do have to think about that, because the CIA, there's no issue. We're not debating whether or not they were involved in the removal of Lumumba from power. And we're going to show you. Some of you have already looked at those documents that I provided to you from the Senate Church Committee. That showed the clear connection. We're going to watch some documents. You're going to hear from the man himself and his role in it, so you can sort of draw your own conclusion about it, right? So I don't need this to be conspiratorial. I just need to make this point here, which is that it was truth there. It may have been a statement that was not the right one to say, and that people would say as, well, this is our president who was killed. But I think people should have heard what he was saying in his entirety. And maybe now we sort of see how important it was what he was saying in his entirety. That, see, when you start going out here doing this comes back, right? And that was a piece we all missed. It's like, all right, other instances, we see the little issue, the one that can draw the emotion out, and then the big piece goes right on out the door, right? because we all missed the moment that, well, yeah, it's bad. JFK was killed in the whole war, whoever, whatever. It was a bad situation. That the standing president was murdered. No one's saying that is a good thing. It was assassinated, right? But when you start to see that, when you see it happen in other places, other folks are listening to that. Other folks could see that. Well, in '61, man, they tore Patrice Lumumba out the frame. You're gonna see. Um, you can look at what happened in Iran. People start seeing, you know, leaders are being removed from power. There are some other instances in Latin America and in the Caribbean, Cuba. And people say, some people are they're in violent revolution here. There's some issues going on here. Um, this kind of thing. It's a tough piece, right? And so then you got a Congo that's really struggling to sort of to assert its national identity, right? Issues of ethnic conflict, and actually UN peacekeepers and other folks, the attacks on the settlers, right? It becomes a mess, right? After it gains its independence, the Belgians sort of are out, but they're only out publicly. They won't sort of act as a military force. They folks sort of stand down. And part of that too is the part of the right of the state to say, well, we're going to put our own peace troops in this. But in the midst of that sort of transition, you can imagine some of the chaos. And European settlers catch the bad end of it. Some of them just there as part of a group of Europeans who have settled on this land, but who at this point now incur the wrath of the local folks in a way that can be very, very horrible, right? Then on the same time, you got this guy who actually had been a very close friend of Patrice Lumumba, who becomes pit and parcel to his assassination. Wow, I mean, it's like a precursor to what you'll hear with Blaise Compaoré and Thomas Sankara. Really, and just in that instance, you can show, wow. But very, very similar. Mobutu, you'll see his story, man. He was like an army guy. He was good friends with Patrice Lumumba. They got to be close and everything, and had come up in a struggle sort of together. But at certain points, they just sort of broke apart. And I think one of them had to do with some of the extreme acts of violence that Mobutu was willing to engage in. And there were some really ugly things, right? In the midst of that too, you had European mercenaries who represented, some of the Belgian sort of multinational interests there, who were shooting and fighting around. Remember, all this mine and all this gold and all this, cobalt and now coltan, and all these things are going to be found there. But guess what else was there early in the mix too? I didn't tell that. I guess I had to say that, Jim, for the very end. Some of you already knew about this, right? 80% of the uranium used in the Manhattan Project came from the Shinkolobwe deposit in where? Belgian Congo. So, I mean, this one gets me sometimes. This is why maybe I have a bit of a scowl here when I have to tell this story, because, this is a tough one to tell, right? When you start to really look up close at the impact of this, right? So you have the use of the material that's used to make a nuclear bomb. You have the largest number of folks brought as captives from out of the region. You have very strong evidence that in the development of a polio vaccine by E. Lilly and other researchers in, of all places, Leopoldville in the Belgian Congo, there were some mistakes made that ultimately brought out an AIDS virus, right? There's been some very real credible sort of critical studies of some of that lends, I would just say, lends some credibility there. So you got AIDS, you got nuclear weapons, and maybe the transatlantic system, the most horrible system of human trafficking ever. All three. And so when you start maybe sort of letting that sink in, and then in a continued state of chaos thereafter, you begin to see this is a sort of a very, very problematic sort of a situation here, and one that has yet to be sort of resolved in its entirety. And when we look at sort of Michelle Wong's piece, you get to see some of the hilarity of it essentially, and the IMF, right? She's the one who starts to look at all this stuff, and she calls it. I mean, and I mentioned her quote in the context of the Rwandan genocide because of the interconnection we already talked about. She calls it the cluster of aid organizations, Hutu and RLF militants, and Western geopolitics, and literally that it is. That's the best way to describe it, right? Mobutu, I mean, he goes kind of buck wild. Ultimately, after he secures control, the country will be called Zaire. He basically will just sort of go crazy with all the resources that are there, and his access to them, and to use them sort of at his own whim, essentially, in the hands of one person, right? And the World Bank is pretty much complicit with what is going on. If you read our piece on Michaela Wong, you can see she pretty credibly makes that case. And I don't even really like the story all that much, but I have to give credit where credit is due, right? And they had uranium. And there's a funny story there. She talks about how they had uranium and they still had it there. From going all the way back there, right? And Belgium actually funded the first nuclear reactor, the first in Africa that was there, right? I mean, there's a whole backstory to that too. I mean, that's an interesting one too. If we get a chance to sort of talk about that some. But think about what the uranium is. This is why the Americans and the CIA went buck wild, and they tried to tear. Literally, they did tear Lumumba apart. They sent the henchmen to tear him apart because he couldn't survive because he opened the door to the Russians, and he didn't really. He just inferred that he would, and I think that was one of the things that people were like, no, we can't do this, right? Other things too. All right, but the regime will end pretty faithfully, right, in the mid '90s there. In the wake of the end of, by the way, Rwanda, and the end of the Rwanda genocide, and those moments when that ends, that's when you'll see the end